Counting or not counting gang violence. A long time ago, some dumbass newt started being hairy and family-oriented and stuff. Like a bunch of Italians. And that was the end of looking like a hard-to-please food critic while a shark ate their grandma. But what if the genetic mutation that gave mammals empathy was different? Well, here's two of them. And they get more insane as it goes on. Okay, first of all, it's hard to define empathy like it's a mechanism because it would degrade the philosophy that allows it to have its desired effect. In a world where you're suffering, someone else is imagining you're suffering, and that same person is affirming you're suffering. What that person imagines you're suffering as needs to have a candid and non-bureaucratic process of seeing you're suffering, or else you'll feel alone. In an ideal world, the chain reaction from suffering to consolation is in one step. No distortion or things that are unlike your suffering. I'll just say this, I'm not here to tell you empathy is good or bad, partly because empathy is where good and bad as constructs come from. I'm here to tell you that empathy is a fundamental thing that exists and is the foundation of society, values, fiction, and the superego. So by doing a thing as heartless as disassembling empathy like an engine and building new empathies from the ground up, I hope to inform you on the things that make our particular empathy special, exploitable, good design, bad design, for the intended purpose it was evolved for. Caretaking, cohesion, value transmission, and understanding others' intentions. Now, the morality around empathy is very fascinating. Let me introduce some terms to make this easier. The empathetic judge is the person's feelings that need support, and their ethical system has good or bad solely based on whether it's affirmed or not affirmed. The empathetic jury is the person that is using empathy to meet the judge's needs under the empathetic values they think they have. Empathetic values are values that are created and reinforced in every empathetic exchange. It's not a system, it's an idea of a value. Then there's the jury's fantasy, which is how the person giving empathy imagines the experience of the person in need of affirmation. The jury and his fantasy are two different things. The fantasy comes from a purely unconscious place that translates the original experience into their own image of it, embedded with hidden agendas and symbolism. So obviously the empathetic judge believes his priorities in essence are being carried all the way to the affirmation, which is the only thing it's designed to want and base its ethics on. But sadly, this is an imaginary desire that requires a sleight of hand to feel satiated. So I've put forward several good and bads, and I don't think we have one, since different components of us want different rules. And I think it's in the empathetic judge's spirit to want one rule set to rule them all. Alright, so the only way there can be multiple rules to the game is if some components of us have to appeal to more authoritative components and suck up like Machiavelli. So for example, empathetic values, which only seek to make every component of us as bribed as possible. The judge feels understood, the jury feels like a good person, but its integrity stops when some part of the empathetic exchange doesn't play ball. So an empathetic value would be something like you deserve to be heard, and what matters is what you feel. Statements framed as facts in order to assure the empathetic judge's legal infallibility. The raw experience of the judge doesn't matter to the jury when the jury's fantasy paints a story that puts the original experience in a bad light. And remember, the fantasy has an autonomy of its own, and the reason it antagonizes has something to do with the jury's unconscious. That visceral outlash of the unconscious is then rebranded as coming from rationality, with systems and inner logic. So because the empathetic values are just trying to please everyone and doesn't have real principles, it allows the thing claiming to be rational to buy it out. Now remember, whatever rationalization of an unconscious response there is, a rational argument cannot defeat a society and the people in it that deep down care about their own empathetic judge. The empathetic values, which have heart, need to be the ultimate poster child puppet state of a needing affirmation morality. Therefore, the rational cancellization, persecution, or exile based on the jury's fantasy needs to seem rational, under the appeal of empathetic values. Alright, so a better way to think about empathetic values is if the jury's fantasy of the empathetic judge is a form of fiction, the empathetic values is a fantasy of the judge and the jury as one empathetic singularity. And this is an auto-fiction that is not using the unconscious of a jury. Now, the naming and definition of these terms comes from a non-empathetic value motivation and therefore comes directly from my unconscious using antisocial language games. A social language game, or just a language game in general, is what Wittgenstein said is how words and definitions personified a meaning that cuts below what we can use categories to express. So this pulsating, autonomous meaning is lived and condoned every time a context is used by it. So when I use words like empathy proper, deserving, and especially conscience, these definitions have taken a life of their own through the fantasy of empathetic values and how they write the story of category. And obviously, antisocial language games happen through transactions within yourself. A huge motivation for wanting to not participate in social meaning is a frustration with only playing a part in a category creation that isn't representing the jury's fantasy, since empathetic values don't care about / acknowledge a fantasy and instead write their own, pretending it's the first of its kind. And then the categories from that fantasy don't like the literary ambiguity it came from. But the hypocrisy of going into yourself to find truth is that you have to invent characters, or personified ideas to have a discord with, to contextualize antisocial language games. So what you might think that you're doing in an act of authenticity and justice is putting the empathetic judge's subjective morality in its place and refusing to create fiction of the original morality of any given component of selfhood. Because remember, authenticity is against deception, but really what's happening is both yours and the person you refuse to empathize with's empathetic judges are both equally right. And nothing will ever change their minds. That being consoled is good. And by creating personified ideas, you are doing deception of some kind by creating fiction. I don't know how much of consciousness is imagination, but as long as we use imagination, we will always be deceived in some way by our ego receiving our unconscious. This, I believe, is the danger of the postmodern manipulator. Someone that is aware of fragmentation and feels the only true expression is to make more aware the deception intrinsic to our humanness. So any act or expression of truth, clarity, or understanding is a deception under the guise for a persona. For them, it's as if an act of manipulation is letting the deceptiveness in both parties speak a candid language. So if I was a postmodern manipulator trying to solve this inescapable deception problem, if I was creating an empathy variant, the solution is obvious. Take away all forms of fiction creation. So let's simulate that through evolution. The first thing is that adorable babies have to go. The very first mammals, in order to propagate, will need to look after their unusually bad at surviving infants that take a while to grow. And perhaps the beginning of our grandiose imagination comes from the necessity to care about the needs of infants, since a logical argument for why you should care requires more abstract thinking. Somehow we have to translate the purely animalistic and selfish desire into a very wholesome and deserving sympathy thing, from observation to interpretation. So an imagination that paints the mother in a heroic and loving light is needed. But what if the postmodern manipulator says the mother isn't designed to have a heroic identity in caring for her kid, and instead has an imagination that is much more tethered in direct observation with minimal unconscious influence? This means how adorable the infant is isn't necessary, and the mother will see his or her empathetic judge as accurately as you can. This means the infantile desire will be seen like any other animal, or like the entropy of two temperatures. And it wouldn't be pathologized, or it wouldn't be made out to be good or bad in the reinterpretation of the jury's fantasy. So the most important thing this does for the postmodern manipulator is it will force him to abandon his identity as manipulator, since there is nothing but the empathetic judge to identify with. There is no form of fiction to reluctantly associate your reality with. But how does that make a race of non-empathetic pragmatists any less manipulative? Well, it doesn't per se, but largely what you are and do is hyperbolized by what you identify with. The postmodern manipulator is as manipulative as any person that participates in fiction deception insofar as they have to. But when you pathologize manipulation in the fiction it's predicated upon, you distort something that's a system into your system. The thing about what's somebody that wants to make a statement in their exhibition of being a manipulator, what that statement wants. At that point, it doesn't want to get something as sneakily and efficiently as possible. It wants to get meaning in the deception itself. So think about this empathy variant and what it means when everyone has the exact same identification with their own empathetic judge. All the empathetic judge wants is to have its way, to be acknowledged, and be important. This universal will is often romanticized as inheriting the stars. Because it takes collaboration, it's not self-obsessed with immediate gratification for power on Earth. It distracts you from the fact the empathetic judge has to be misinterpreted by fiction to work with others. It will settle for the stars as long as it's an idealistic form of being important. For this fictionless version of empathy, diagnosing everyone as narcissists wouldn't make sense for a few reasons. Fundamentally, everyone identifies with an idealist striving for importance, and this empathetic judge is more terrifying because it's not mediated by fantasy. Meaning the grandiose narcissist movie star that wants a role that makes them as cool as possible isn't the same as the empathetic judge whose self and movie role are the same thing. So what makes the empathetic judge scarier now is that he isn't reduced to some courtroom that never leaves the psyche, letting the social fiction world take action. This judge is actualizing. Now, the judge that thinks he is the tyrant of the world, but is dehumanized by the fiction that makes him only an instinct serving as human, understands at some level, and by that I mean he adjusts his behavior to how the jury's fantasy is sure as he's been understood. He isn't actually. He's not. He's not understood. The judge has to think he's understood, and so whatever affirmation the fiction he's dehumanized gives, there's truth in that language of dehumanization. So whatever a judge that does not think in dehumanization's terms will expect to receive consolation as if he's more than what's allowed to be human. And this empathy variant will have other people's messianic empathetic judges to order them that they have the consolation that they need. So if nothing ordered them that they have the right consolation, they wouldn't even need consolation and just become a cancer of over-amplifying selfhood. Alright, let's talk about values without empathy proper. Standard empathetic values are not arguments or instructions in and of themselves. They suggest what they'd like to happen, but in a way that tries to give agency for things to be held accountable by their conscience, so the statement doesn't seem pushy. Ought is a favorite of empathetic values. The values cannot outright state their motivation because that admits subjectivity in its fiction, and these are supposed to be the laws the judge always wanted to have the final say for. But now that there's no fiction creation, value statements come directly from the judge, which has no strategy or suggestion, just motivation. So now if the, I'll say, more than human judge, which is different from the dehumanized judge, is never told that they have the consolation that they require, value statements would not have a sequence and just have a want word. Whatever the judge wants. And this want is a motivation, an objective, a command, an identity. If you were an omnipotent deity, nothing could force you to parse your motivation into a multi-step how to get what you want. The ultimate disillusionment for a more than human judge is that it needs to negotiate with other judges to survive, and admitting they can't get whatever they want regardless of method. Now, a judge can never truly accept it isn't powerful enough. So when a method that their motivation is slave to is stated, a resentment is also put in the statement. So want is replaced with want as dictated by method. So every time two people look into each other's empathetic judges to size up a negotiation, a castrated value is created. These values don't suggest the humans that ought to be held accountable, but sympathize with the motivations that have to be held accountable. Essentially, whatever part of a motivation that isn't allowed to be godlike is held as the social limit on grounds of negotiation. And this is why the postmodern manipulator would regret having created this empathy variant, because his whole identity was created around rejecting social values to create his own system, and even then, he can always lie about a new system. When the limits of what you can get are baked into the values that come from the most honest place possible, you have to start identifying with your empathetic judge and abandon the fiction that you hated so much but gave you the comfort of not being held accountable. Alright, so I actually wrote and voiced the second empathy variant, but it was just kind of in too bad taste, and I was in an entirely different mood, so I decided to omit it. I would possibly consider sharing it if this video gets liked enough. Goodbye, my dudes.